Hey everyone, thank you for joining us. We're so excited to kick off another Datadog Detect. I'm Andrew Krug, and I lead the security advocacy team here at Datadog.
And I'm Kennedy Toomey, security advocate at Datadog. Welcome, everyone.
The response from our first Detect conference blew us away. Over 1,000 people registered for the live event, and the community feedback was incredible. It just goes to show how much the security operations community values learning from each other, and we're excited to deliver another fantastic lineup for you all today.
First, some quick housekeeping items. We absolutely encourage you to ask questions throughout all the presentations. Just be sure to direct questions to the Q&A tab found at the bottom of your Zoom screens, separate from the chat. These talks are pre-recorded, but the speakers, as well as security experts from the Datadog team, will be present to answer questions, share insights, and discuss the problems we are all facing in threat detection and response. And if you want to revisit the content and share it with your organization or peers, no worries. This webinar is being recorded and will be emailed to all registrants.
And with that, let's get into our agenda for today. Our goal was to curate a diverse set of speakers and topics so that everyone can walk away with the latest learnings and tactics that you can apply directly to your work. We will have 3 talks and a live Q&A session. Just a note that all of this is in Eastern Daylight Time. From 12 to 12:20, David Burkett from Corelight will be presenting his talk, Silence of the Daemons: Why Evasion Isn't About Location and NDR's Role in the Cloud. From 12:20 to 12:40, Megan Roddy Fonseca from Datadog will be talking about the Goldilocks approach, finding detections that are just right. And last but not least, 12:40 to 1, Katie Nichols and Jesse Griggs from Red Canary are bringing their talk, Same Adversary, New Terrain, Adapting an Endpoint Detection Mindset to the Cloud, followed by a live Q&A at the end from 1 to 1:30.
All right, so how about we get started with our first speaker? I'm thrilled to introduce David Burkett, Cloud Security Researcher from Corelight. Please welcome David.
Hey everybody, my name is David Burkett. I'm a cloud security researcher at Corelight, and today we're going to talk about evading cloud container runtime monitoring tooling and the role of network detection and response in the cloud. It's a really interesting topic because there's not very much information out there. Most of the cloud network detection related write-ups are from the perspective of host-based tools, which have a lot of different caveats, different metadata that's collected and available. And it really means that whenever it comes to network detection in the cloud, I really get to be on a lot of the cutting edge stuff, which is a lot of fun. As I mentioned, I work for Corelight. If you're not familiar with this, Vern Paxson, the creator of Zeek's one of our co-founders. And if you're not familiar with me, again, my name is David. I've built a couple of security operations centers now. The last one that I managed, the security program for the organization, we won a Cogswell Award for being one of the top 1% of security programs in the classified and cleared space, something I'm really proud of. And I also co-authored one of the first public white papers on doing detection as code back in 2019. I think he started it back in 2018. So I've been doing detection and response for quite some time now. But let's get into the actual meat of what we're going to talk about. If you've been keeping up with the latest intel, there was recently a CISA joint advisory that discussed China or Chinese nation-state actors were evading EDR tooling. They were specifically targeting things like edge devices, such as VPN appliances or firewalls, things that just specifically can't run EDR. And a big reason for this shift and pivot is, well, obviously attackers are always going to look for ways to evade security controls. But the reality is, EDRs have gotten so good that they've really made the life of an attacker on an endpoint difficult. We, as a security industry, have started getting those behaviors down, like the things that the adversaries need to do to execute code, and then investigating them whenever it comes to a system that we can actually see the telemetry for. The problem is there's a lot of things that we either can't or they just don't provide telemetry, such as IoT devices or just things along those lines where, again, we can't run that EDR. So these are the places that adversaries are starting to live. And it's something that if we in the cloud world, it's something that we should start preparing for. In my mind, the cloud workload protection tools or the cloud container runtime monitoring tooling is even more effective than EDR. Containers have the benefit of having the visibility from pre-deployment to deployment. They're often immutables, meaning there's not a lot of change that actually happens. So just change in and of itself can be identification of something malicious or suspicious. And with that, you can definitely expect that if your red team hasn't already been using some of the techniques that we're going to talk about today, you're probably going to start seeing it in the near future for all of the same reasons that adversaries are evading EDRs and endpoints. And again, it's because that visibility has gotten so mature on the endpoint. And a mantra that we've probably all repeated, myself included, is the cloud is just somebody else's computer. So if I have cluster admin, that's not really any different than if I have admin or local admin on a Windows system or root on a Linux machine. I can go through and I can do things like kill the EDR, uninstall it, whatever it might be, add firewall rules. The same things apply to a Kubernetes cluster. If I, for example, have a privileged pod or a privileged application that's running, maybe there's a supply chain compromise in the container. Maybe one of the software libraries, again, gets a supply chain compromise. Maybe an admin accidentally downloads a backdoor piece of putty or a tool called putty or some other kind of management tool. There's all kinds of ways that attackers can get this admin access that they need. And again, if they get the admin on a Kubernetes cluster, they can do all the same damage they could on a traditional host. So, for example, your cloud workload protection tooling is probably going to have to talk to a SaaS console. If you block the tooling from communicating to that SaaS console, you can't get alerts anymore from that tool. And that's the case whether it's EDR or container runtime tooling. And because of this, we need some other way to get that visibility in case this happens. So, and we can't rely on all of our security controls. As we can all attest, things fail and we need to have backups. That's the whole concept of having these detections in depth and overlaying your detection capabilities and having overlapping security controls is for the case when one of those fails. And one of the things that's really key to keep in mind, the purpose of this talk is not to make the case that NDR is better than container runtime monitoring tooling. I don't think that that's necessarily the case. They both complement each other. Ideally, you would have both in a real world. So that's not something that you should take away from it, in that, maybe NDR is better or in an either or scenario, but really the idea is getting both. So again, we might have attackers blinding our Kubernetes cluster. They might modify those config maps, whatever it might be, and that can cause those tooling to stop checking in with us. Now we have a blind spot in our cluster. This would be no different than if they were interacting on-prem. So maybe they, or for example, have just hidden one malicious container rather than blocking the whole node. And your container workload protection, it's still communicating out. Everything looks fine, but it's just not monitoring the specific pod that the attacker is controlling based on their ability to modify the config map, for example. So something to just keep in mind. So let's talk about network detection in the cloud. One of the things that it's important to know is whenever you're monitoring these managed Kubernetes clusters, you're not really gaining or losing any visibility whenever you're compared to what you're doing on-prem, with one exception. The Kubernetes API that you're probably used to working with is not going to typically be available in a cloud network tab. And the reason being is because they manage that infrastructure for you. So you're typically interacting with that cloud console, and that's not traffic that you can tap because that's basically going through in the internet. So it's something to keep in mind. But through the use of your guard duty logs or something along those lines, that could be a way to keep on that blind spot. But with that, you can still see your node-to-node traffic just like you could on-prem. That's no different. Attackers still have to interact with their compromised infrastructure. Again, no different than on-prem. So there's going to be that network communication. If you have network detection and response tools, one of the first things that I kind of run into whenever I talk about doing network detection in the cloud is everything's encrypted these days. And they're right. Everything is encrypted these days for good reason. And one of the things that network detection and using Zeek specifically for network detection and response in the cloud, it gives you so much network metadata that you can actually do really powerful detection. And there's a ton of stuff that you can detect despite encryption. And it's a lot easier than you might think. So, for example, one of the things, and I think I might have mentioned this in the prior slide, is container runtime tools. They benefit from the fact that containers are traditionally deployed as immutable runtimes, so they're not going to change in the environment, and that can really benefit us as defenders, meaning we can baseline the behavior of a container or an application much, much easier. That means whenever you're looking at the destination ports, for example, that a container might use or call over, having those baseline can provide a super high value way of detecting stuff, even if it is encrypted. Despite that, you're getting all of your DNS requests, you catch all your sitting tunnels through DNS, ICMP, all of these other various protocols, the TLS data that you can get, like such as the SNI, is really powerful. For example, whenever maybe attackers or malware is trying to communicate out to a mining pool, for example, and have that traffic encrypted, but maybe they're not, making a DNS request. They have some sort of hard-coded connection or something. There's all kinds of reasons. There's also been the advent of JA3, JA4, something that we maintain at Corelight is the hash SH, which allows you to go through fingerprint SSH connections. Again, that's super powerful in the cloud. If you look at the recent CISA joint advisory, one of the recent Chinese threat actors was using a custom SFTP tool, which, if you're not familiar, uses SSH under the hood, allowing you to, if you have hash SH or Corelight, it is an open source package that you can add if you have Zeek. You can start fingerprinting the SSH connections in your environment and getting an idea of what kind of actual SSH agents there actually are. And that, again, becomes a powerful baseline despite being encrypted traffic. Like I mentioned, take advantage of the cloud and the fact that a lot of this stuff is going to be immutable despite the cloud infrastructure typically being elastic, meaning it could scale horizontally. That typically doesn't really translate to much difference when it comes to the network behaviors, other than it might have more source IP addresses, but you can handle that through things like subnets or other metadata that you enrich with your network sensor. So, for example, Corelight, if you're monitoring your network with the Corelight sensor, we go through and pull out the IP addresses from your cloud network provider and then enrich them with your con logs, and it gives you a whole bunch more information on which VPC is calling from which IP address to which IP address. And it can just be so much more useful. Whenever it comes to cloud network detection and really just network detection in general, context is everything. And really, I would just say even just detection as a whole. So let's talk about the situation. So let's say you can't tap a network. You're not out of luck. There's something called VPC flow logs. You can think of these as the cloud equivalent of NetFlow. They contain a little bit more data, such as some cloud-specific stuff. So instead of just being your 5-tuple of your IP address ports and stuff, it's going to also have things like your VPC IDs, subnet IDs. Just depending on the cloud provider, it'll have different information. But one of the recommendations I typically recommend is use later versions of VPC flow when possible. There's I think version 2 is enabled by default, and it contains just some very minimal metadata, but each version that increments all the way up to, I think it's up to VPC flow version 8 now, has more and more metadata. And if you're going to be limited to VPC flow, again, context is king in everything. And the more that you're able to get that context around those network connections from that VPC flow data, the more detection opportunities that you're going to have based on that network data. And one of the, again, the big benefits of a tool like Corelight is we can actually stitch together those VPC flow logs. So if they have too much log volume or something, it really reduces the amount that you're actually ingesting, allowing you to ingest even more logs than you could to begin with. So one of the cool things that we're actually doing is we're turning those VPC flow logs into con logs, like you can see in the screenshot. And you can then use those logs to go through and write Seek scripts against it. That makes it just so much more powerful. It's a lot of fun. And one of the other kind of things that stitching together that we can do, it will really reduce the log volume. I think the stats show up to 90%, but that's probably optimal network traffic. I would say it's definitely still up there, though, closer to the 50, 60 plus consistently. But, hey, who knows? Maybe you'll get lucky and it'll be the optimum case. But regardless, NetFlow is out there, VPC flow is out there, and it could be a very powerful detection capability. And of course, you have all your typical traditional IOC-based detections that you can do around those. Again, context around those will really help drive up your fidelity, minimizing those false positives, because IP address alone as an indicator of compromise, those are pretty prone to false positives. So we talked about some of these already, but let's go through some detection starting points for if you're doing network detection and response in the cloud. Like I mentioned, there's almost nothing out here when it comes to NDR in the cloud. This quote by Rob Joyce is just really so prescient because this same concept applies even in the cloud. So, despite me even saying earlier, it's just someone else's computer, it's all in the cloud and stuff. For some reason, we really think as an industry that there's going to be a lot of massive differences, and in a lot of ways that there are. But when it comes to some of the traditional and foundational security controls that you're going to want to implement, things like network security monitoring, a lot of those have established benefits that still are useful in the cloud for the exact same reasons. So, for example, there's this famous quote from Rob Joyce. You're all probably familiar, former director of NSA, but he said something along the lines in the past of, one of our worst nightmares is that a threat actor has an out-of-band network tap capturing our network data. And basically, for those that aren't familiar, an out-of-band network tap just means it's not set in a configuration. So you can't tell that you're actually being monitored through that network traffic because from your adversary's perspective, there's no visibility into it, which is makes it very difficult or makes life very difficult for those threat actors. So why not do the same thing in the cloud? And while you can't necessarily get that out-of-band network tap in the same way, you're limited to more like VTAPs and span ports. The concept is still the same, and you still get a lot of the same benefits. So let's talk again about some of the detection starting points. So again, hit on this earlier. Cloud traffic, just because of its nature, again, in the immutability, it's going to be much more consistent in its behavior. So you can have those easier baselines. One of the really strong ones that I pointed to earlier was baselining the destination ports that your cloud infrastructure uses. If you can do it down to specific applications, that could be so powerful, can knock out entire classes of detections. Attacks. So rather, like, for example, let's say if I have a reverse shell, if I'm using any port other than the one that your app communicates out over, regardless of if my communication over it is encrypted or not, I've just detected that activity. You tie that back to the process that made the request, and boom, you've got a really good detector there for you. Becomes super hard to evade, makes things like scanning really difficult, really powerful. Use something like the peak threat hunting framework if you've never done baselining before, and that can go through and give you a structured approach to doing things like finding some of these baselines, building some of these anomaly detections, and having documented in a really great way. Another thing that's really common, and this has always been really interesting to me, we'll see these supply chain attacks with hundreds of millions of downloads. I think maybe some of the big ones that even potentially had like 1 billion downloads. And it seems like the threat actors always just deploy a coin miner for some reason. Despite that, I'll take it. Coin miners have to talk out to the mining pool. That opens up detection opportunities. Suricata out of the box, just because this is such a prominent threat, has these pretty well covered, which is a really great, again, benefit for NDR tooling. Not only that, but if you have something like the Zeek metadata, there's so much that you can do to just get some of those like mining pool, just writing simple sim rules against that metadata on like the TLS SNI. There's just so much opportunity there for detecting those coin miners. And another thing, and this goes back to kind of what I touched on earlier, enrichment and context is everything, especially whenever it comes to network detection. So whenever we're thinking about network attacks and cloud attacks, one behavior that adversaries use is they'll use things like Tor, they'll use consumer VPNs, like a commercial one that you might just go buy as a regular everyday person, or they might use things like Telegram, Discord, Steam, just these services to blend in that are legitimate, not necessarily malicious, maybe with the exception of Tor to a lot of people, so that are not inherently malicious. But if you have some of that enrichment that allows you to go through and do things like finding some of these some of these services that are probably not likely to be legitimately used in your environment. Like I've really struggled to think of many organizations that have like an enterprise application that needs to speak to Telegram without it being more of an exception than the rule, easily something allow listed. Same thing for Steam. So if you add a lot of these contexts, such as things like the user VPNs, ASNs, there's all kinds of stuff that you can add to this metadata that really raises the bar again for the adversary. So again, like if they're using VPNs that are consumer grade, probably don't need to be talking to that. Maybe one of the things that threat actors are doing now is they're compromising, small office and home office routers and using that as a pivot point for their compromises. A lot of network applications or a lot of enterprise applications never need to actually speak to a residential address. And just having some of that enrichment data can be so powerful for detection. And just getting some of that enrichment and some of that context, again, being king, gives you so many opportunities for baselining and detection. So even if that traffic is encrypted, you can detect stuff that you would maybe otherwise miss. So that's going to be my talk for you guys today. I hope you enjoyed it. Again, my name is David. I'm with Corelight. You can follow me on LinkedIn. I'm happy to answer any questions, and I look forward to participating in the Q&A with all of you. Thanks for joining me today. Thanks so much.
Thanks, David. As a reminder, we have all of our great speakers on with you live to answer any questions you might have at the end of each session. So don't be afraid to utilize that Q&A function. Next up, we'll hear from one of our own security engineers at Datadog. She's going to get into some of the challenges and trade-offs that come with trying to find the perfect detection. Please welcome Senior Security Engineer Megan Roddy Fonseca.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining Datadog Detect to hear my talk, The Goldilocks Approach, Finding Detections That Are Just Right. My name is Megan Roddy Fonseca, and I am a Senior Detection Engineer here at Datadog. We're going to go ahead and get started. I want to talk to you about some concepts traditionally that came from a machine learning data classification background. So there's going to be some terminology that may be unfamiliar. But I'm going to go through these concepts and then I'm going to show you their application to detection engineering. So to start, we're going to look at precision. Precision is the fraction of relevant instances among retrieved instances. So out of all items the model identifies as relevant, so let's say alerts, how many were actually relevant? So this is the quality of positive predictions or our true positive rate. Then we're going to look at recall. Recall is the fraction of relevant instances that were retrieved. So out of all items that were relevant or true positive or positives, we'll say, how many were correctly identified? So it's about the model's ability to find all relevant cases. So we want all true positives, no false negatives, right? And these two concepts kind of work in combination to give us our accuracy, which is the fraction of instances that were correctly classified. So out of all the instances or events in our case, how many did the detection correctly classify? So it's a measure of overall correctness. So we want, this is great. This is low false positive, high true positive. Let me rephrase this now, because again, we're talking instances, relevant, retrieved, models. Maybe this is very unfamiliar. So what do these concepts look like when it comes to detection engineering? Well, precision, we can rephrase as the fraction of relevant malicious events, so true positives, among all events matched by a detection, both true positives and false negatives. Sorry, true positives and false positives. So higher precision detections create fewer false positives. Great. So we want our detections to be high precision. We also want our detections to be high recall, because recall is the fraction of relevant malicious events that are detected. So out of all activity, there's a subset of malicious activity, and the recall is how much of that malicious activity was detected. So high recall is fewer false negatives, or less missed malicious activity. So we want high recall and high precision. We also want high accuracy, where accuracy is the fraction of correctly classified activity among all activity. So we want true positives and true negatives, and we don't want false positives or false negatives. So high accuracy detections detect the majority of malicious activity without generating false positives. Okay? So I'm going to give you the mathematics of this. Some people are going to tune out now, but this can help understand these concepts more. And also you may be able to implement these metrics. Now, some are harder to implement, but we'll talk about that. First, we have precision. It's very easy to calculate precision because this is our true positive rate, or our false positive rate if you reverse it. Precision is the number of true positives out of true positives and false positives. So out of all detected activity, how much was correctly detected? Right? This is easy to calculate when your security analysts classify detections, alerts as true positive or false and negative. You can calculate, or true positive, false positive, you can calculate how many are true positive. Now, recall is the number of true positives, but out of the malicious activity, which is the true positives and the false negatives. Now, this is harder to calculate because false negatives are essentially an unknown. Now, you may say there was an incident that detections missed, and this detection should have caught it, so that's a false negative. But it's really hard to say with 100% certainty that there's a specific number of false negatives, because if you missed it, you don't know. Right? And lastly, we have our accuracy, which is the number of true positives and true negatives. So everything correctly classified, whether it's malicious or not, out of all the data we analyzed, out of what ends up being our true positives, true negatives, false positives, and false negatives. Again, harder to calculate because you have to know your false negatives. You have to know what you missed, which if you missed it, you might not know you missed it. So when we're writing detections, what's the goal of a detection engineer? Is it precision? Is it recall? Is it accuracy? And really the goal of a detection engineer is for a perfectly accurate detection. Something being perfectly accurate would mean that you caught everything that was malicious and you caught nothing that was not malicious with a detection. But in reality, this is practically unachievable. We'll see some examples. You could do an indicator-based detection, but those aren't necessarily efficient. So when we're talking about behavioral detections, we want something that is perfectly accurate. While that is unachievable, we can find a middle ground. So let's visualize these concepts and apply some examples to understand more in depth why this is unachievable. So starting with recall, what would perfect recall look like? Now, let's say that this detection, or let's say all these events are registry persistence. So you have some benign events, system administrators installing software and adding persistence, or an application itself, running at start. There might be registry activity and it's benign. But you might also have threat actors establishing persistence in the registry and making malware execute on boot. So a perfect recall detection, so this circle, if that's our detection, we could say alert on every single registry persistence event. So all the keys that could lead to persistence, tell us if one of those keys are modified. That would be this detection. Now, this is great because anytime a threat actor establishes persistence via the registry, we're going to catch it. But in order to do that, we've also said that anytime anyone legitimately uses the registry for persistence, our security team needs to respond and determine whether it's a true positive or false positive. And that's probably not feasible in terms of false positive rates. Your team doesn't want to be reviewing as much benign activity as malicious activity. Okay? So in this case, we want to be more precise. We want to get less of those false positives, and we want the majority to be true positives. So when we do that, let's say we say the persistence is established to execute a payload called malware.exe. Now, when that happens, we say, yes, absolutely, that's malicious activity. The payload's called malware. That's not legitimate activity, so it must be a true positive. And we see that in this case. There's no false positives. We know that those events are malicious. But I'm not going to go into Pyramid of Pain and summiting the pyramid. I highly recommend you research it. But basically what that says is that since we are basing this off of a file name, and a threat actor can easily change a file name, that there's likely to be a ton of other malicious activity at some point in which this detection would not work. So yes, we're only catching true positives. Our security analysts are happy because when they get paged about these alerts, they know it's bad. They know there's not going to be benign activity captured. But we're doing that at the risk of missing anything where persistence is established by a threat actor without their payloads named malware.exe. Right? So hopefully you see the problem here with perfect precision and perfect recall. We can be perfectly precise. Great thing is no false positives. Bad thing is we miss stuff. We never want to miss stuff. Perfect recall, again, great because we catch all the malicious activity. Bad because we're sending our security analysts in circles. So we need to find a middle ground. So a middle ground might be that the registry key was created from the command line using specific arguments, and it's specifically the run key. So now that removes anything where a system administrator is using the registry editor UI or an application is installing this. And you're left with maybe a script that runs from a sysadmin that uses the command line and that registry key. You capture more malicious activity now. Here's some ones that weren't executing malware.exe. And so we've captured more, but we're still kind of missing stuff. It's not great to miss stuff. But what are our alternatives? Flood the SOC with false positives? Or, what's our alternative to not flooding the SOC? We're going to reduce our scope and end up with true positives. So this is why I kind of called this talk the Goldilocks approach, because, you don't want too broad. You don't want too narrow. You want something that's just right and is tolerable in terms of what you're going to detect. And we can write other detections to capture this. Maybe there's a second set of registry persistence behaviors that would capture these hypothetical activities. So we can combine detections. But we also don't want to have to cherry pick and say, okay, malware.exe or this or that. And suddenly you have 20 detections that need maintaining and monitoring that each will probably still have false positives to some extent. And it's just not feasible to cherry pick right detections so narrow and so many detections to catch all the activity. We need behavioral detections that are hard to evade, but those come with the risk of false positives. Right? So the unfortunate reality is that we're dealing with what in data classification or machine learning would be a high base rate. What that essentially means is that it's not going to be this pretty division of 50% malicious, 50% benign, and you're just expanding and narrowing and capturing more or less false positive. In reality, for the majority of organizations, hopefully, Hopefully your organization looks like this, where you're going to have a sea of benign activity. So maybe daily registry persistence is established via regular methods, but occasionally a registry persistence event pops up in here. Again, we could cherry pick and say, well, that one was malware.exe and this one, wasn't malware.exe, but it was a specific parent process with very specific command line arguments. And we could write 7 detections that capture all that. But what happens when, that very specific detection is evaded? Because to be specific, you are likely going to use indicators that are easily evadable. And now you have another activity that pops up and you can't catch it and you need another detection. So again, we can't just play this game of whack-a-mole with these detections. We do have to make them more behavioral to be effective, but you're having to capture them within a sea of benign activity. So that's where the major challenge is. So leveraging these concepts, how do we use these concepts to find that middle ground? The first thing you need to do is understand your organization's tolerance for false positives. Depending on who you are, what your middle ground is going to be different. Because if you're in a very small business where your security team is a guy who half his time he's doing sysadmin work or projects related to security. He's a security engineer, but he also triages alerts on the side. That one guy is not going to be able to handle a high rate of false positives. Let's say we're getting 50 false positives a day. So if you have 50 false positives a week. So if you have one guy who's triaging security alerts, that one guy has 50 false positives in, let's say, a business week. Now, if you're a large organization and you have 25 security analysts in a SOC and their job 24/7 or during business hours is solely to triage security alerts, they don't have other engineering work or things like that, then now 50 alerts a week becomes 2 alerts per person. 2 false positives per person. That's pretty tolerable. 2 false positives per day per person, or per week per person. Easy peasy, they can handle it. So all this to say, there is no perfect number that applies to all organizations. You need to figure out what your tolerance is. And we create this feedback loop with our incident response team. We check in with them. Hey, what's the false positive rate like? Is this bearable? Do we need to tune some alerts, etc.? The second thing is to use historical data. If you're using a SIM and you have your detection rules, maybe your SIM has a feature, or even just using search, you can look at the existing data and understand how a rule will perform. So you could search all registry events and, oh, look, this is like 1 million events. Not feasible. Okay, well, what if I add a filter for parent process? Okay, well, now I've narrowed it down, to 100 events. Is there some malicious events I know or some command line arguments I see that I could exclude? So use that historical data and tune. And then continuously monitor your rule performance. Just because a rule is low false positive now doesn't mean something in your environment won't change to make the criteria detect on more normal behavior. So create a dashboard or run monthly or weekly metrics and understand how are specific rules doing and do those specific rules need tuning. And then lastly, determine the impact of tuning a rule. And what I mean by that is that if I'm tuning a rule for a very high impact thing, so maybe it's data exfiltration, bulk data exfiltration, if I start doing heavy tuning on that and narrowing the scope too much, the impact is great, because if I miss that activity, the impact that it has is severe. But if we're talking about like a low severity reconnaissance based alert, if that has a high false positive rate, I can tune it with more wiggle room, because if I miss something, the impact is not going to be as big. I can probably catch further attack activity further in the kill chain. So just think about, if I tune this, what will I miss? And if I miss that, what is the impact to my organization? So I just want to show you some examples of this in my day-to-day work. Now, this is not a Datadog pitch. Hopefully your SIM has a feature like this, but in Datadog Cloud SIM, we can run historical jobs. So we can run a detection rule against historical data. So I was writing a rule for repeated connections to a block URL, see if we could see C2 traffic essentially. And I wrote my rule, and it had 7 hits, which over a month, acceptable false positive rate for our org. However, there was known malicious activity from a recent incident that I didn't see in the results and expected. So I went back to the incident activity. I saw, okay, this is why I missed it. I adjusted my rule, and now it has 28 hits. And so those were true positive, but it was still too many false positives for me to feel comfortable putting this into production. So then I did some tuning. I excluded certain things. I reran the job, adjusted the threshold, and ended up with 13 results, the majority of those being malicious activity related to some known activity, some were duplicates. And the false positive rate was low enough that I feel like my incident response team would be happy with the false positive rate. So you see, I went from 7 to 28. So this was too narrow. This was too broad. This was just right. One other thing to mention about how I do this in my day-to-day with Datadog when it comes to tuning is creating suppressions. Now, you might not have things called suppressions, but you might have tuning methods where this is still relevant. Something might be happening in your org. Maybe there's some migration activity or a service account temporarily being used for something that it wasn't before. And you have a bunch of rules where this would cause things to start firing. Maybe you saw it start firing. We can add a suppression that eliminates a certain subset activity. We can even set an expiration. So maybe this is just related to a month-long project. So we say for the month of October, don't trigger any detections for any rules where the service account is this or the AWS account is this. Okay? When you are tuning a rule, though, just like I said in the last point on on our list of things to consider, is when you make a suppression too broad, you're introducing risk, and you need to determine whether that risk is acceptable. Is the number of false positives you're eliminating worth the potential activity or miss? So that's something I'll always keep in mind while tuning. Okay. So that was my talk. I want to conclude this, wrapping up one of the key points that this talk was supposed to get across, which is detection engineering is hard. Okay? When you create rules that are too broad, your security team is going to be mad at you, your response team, because the false positive rate is high and they're getting burnt out. When you create rules that are too specific, you're going to miss something. A security incident is going to happen, and the management is going to be asking you, why did we miss this? Why was there not a detection for this? So this is not an easy task to accomplish. My point today was to give you some concepts to think about and ways to visualize when you're writing rules, understanding that there's not a way to make a perfectly accurate rule while efficiently detecting attacker behavior, but that we can find a middle ground and do our best. And maybe we miss something. Maybe on occasion our security team is burnt out, but we're going to continue to learn and adjust and learn our organization too. It's a lot about learning your organization. So thank you for attending my talk, and I'm passionate about this topic. Would love to discuss it more.
Big thanks to Megan for that great presentation. To close out our lineup, we're thrilled to introduce 2 experts from Red Canary, Katie Nichols and Jesse Griggs. Please welcome Katie and Jesse.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today. My name is Katie Nichols. I'm a senior director at Red Canary. I lead our research, intelligence, and hunting teams. I've been at Red Canary for about 6 years, previously worked in intelligence and at MITRE.
Hi, everyone. Jesse Griggs. I'm a senior threat researcher here at Red Canary. I've only been here for about a year, and then I also previously worked at MITRE on attack and a few other projects.
And we're really excited to be here today to talk to you a little bit about applying an endpoint mindset to cloud threat detection. Let's dive right in. We're going to cover a couple topics today. First off, we're going to start pretty broadly, thinking about as domains, how do we compare and contrast cloud and endpoint? Then I'm going to give you some tips for how to successfully follow cloud threats, even as they are a little bit different than endpoint. Then Jesse's going to deep dive walking you through a ransomware intrusion and also helping you with some tips to detect in the cloud. So let's start pretty big picture, right? In my background, I was on the MITRE attack team for years, focusing so much on endpoint, TTPs and threats. And as I encountered cloud threats, it was a little intimidating, right? And the good news is, as I'm going to walk you through, we can take a lot of the concepts we know from endpoint or whatever background or operating system you have knowledge of, right, and apply that to cloud. As I dove in, the good news is cloud is kind of easy, right? There are these things, API calls, just requests for information or action. And okay, it's just users, API calls, and permissions. I can do that. But as you might know, not that easy, right? There are thousands of those API actions, including a secret menu of undocumented ones. So how am I supposed to track 40,000 of these things? Back on the easy side though, okay, users, they only have the permissions that are granted to them. So that's not too bad, right? We can really restrict. There are over 40,000 different permissions, right? With over half of them being designated high risk. Don't know about you, I cannot track 40,000 different permissions. And the great news though, on the easy side, everything is logged, right? As analysts, as detection engineers, we want to have perfect visibilities. Everything is logged in the cloud. That's fantastic. As you might know though, that's maybe not fantastic. Drowning in data, don't really know where to go. So again, cloud may be easy in the primitives, a little bit tougher, especially in terms of scale. Now, following cloud threats is both same, but different, but actually the same, right? Perfect meme to track this idea. Again, as I went through this journey, right, I found that a lot of the foundations of how do we build a case for attribution in the intelligence world, how do we track TTPs, prioritize TTPs for detection, they very much apply to the cloud world. So again, we have to think about both similarities and differences so we can be successful no matter what our backgrounds are. Let's walk through a tale of two ransomware intrusions. Let's start on endpoint, right? Where I'm the most comfortable, maybe some of you are, walking through a pre-ransomware intrusion into actual ransomware. This is an Akira intrusion train that we and others around the community have been seeing a lot of. Pretty classic initial access, exploiting a vulnerability, logging in from a VPS. Now, my background's in intelligence, and one of the things we love to do in intelligence is do attribution. If you were watching this intrusion, that initial access probably not going to be enough for you to say it's Akira ransomware doing this. So let's continue on. Right? Our next phase, discovery or reconnaissance, whatever flavor of kill chain you like, this kill chain foundation is really helpful, as you'll see as we get to cloud intrusions. So in the endpoint world for this ransomware intrusion, adversaries used NLTest, common command, also a tool called SharpShares. Not super unique though. Even as we move to lateral movement, RDP, jokingly standing for Ransomware Deployment Protocol, and IMPacket, commonly used tools for lateral movement. But luckily, the adversary threw us a bone, or not, when they encrypted the environment, right? Encrypted files and then dropped that ransomware note, Akira readme.txt. That's sort of our smoking gun when it comes to attribution in terms of an endpoint ransomware intrusion. What about cloud? If you've never looked through or navigated a cloud intrusion, you still have this same kill chain foundation and building blocks that you can use. Right? Let's take a look. On the top, let's walk through a cloud ransomware intrusion, and Jesse's going to deep dive this in just a couple minutes. Initial access, they logged in, right, with specific Azure admin role permissions. Discovery or reconnaissance, adversaries used a common tool called Azure Hound, right, part of Bloodhound, which you can actually test, as we'll talk about later. Lateral movement. How do adversaries move laterally in the cloud? Well, once again, they sign in. A little more generic, right, than maybe on endpoint. Sometimes we have specific malware, a specific hash. We know it's a loader, right? Not quite the same in cloud. Then that last stage, impact, where the bad stuff happens. Endpoint, we had that Akira ransomware note. In cloud, adversary just mass deleted a bunch of resources. No real calling card there. Comparing and contrasting, right? Ransomware intrusions on-prem and in the cloud can show us, right, that same foundation of the kill chain really works. But as you get to things like attribution, you might have to think a little bit creatively because it might not be quite as straightforward in cloud as it is in endpoint. Let's make it a little more complex too, right? I pictured these as different intrusion chains, which that's totally a lie. What if, as part of the adversary's lateral movement from an on-prem environment, they move laterally to your cloud environment? A lot more complexity there as we're tracking these threats. So what do? A lot of complexity, a lot of things to track, thousands of API calls and permissions. We do the same thing we do every night, Pinky. We follow the threats. Again, the basics. Go back to the basics. We try to prioritize based on what the threats are doing, whether it's endpoint or cloud. Now, the MITRE ATT&CK screenshot on the slide is actually from 2019, a blog I wrote then. The same principles apply. The idea here is we take one group, we map the TTPs in yellow, different group in blue, yellow plus blue equals green. So the green TTPs or techniques, those are the ones that these two adversaries are using. Same thing. Look across a bunch of different reporting on what cloud threats are doing, and then prioritize the things that they're doing a lot of. Then pass that off to your detection team. As Jesse's going to talk about, right, they can figure out how to use that knowledge of TTPs to create detections. Now, when I was on the team at Attack a couple of years ago, we always lamented, like, there's just not good reporting on cloud threats like there is in the endpoint world. In 6 years that I've been at Red Canary, things have changed, fortunately. And here are a couple of the sources that we like on our team to go to, right, for information about cloud threats and what they're doing. Attack, of course, they map a bunch of different open sources. Datadog, we're not just saying that because it's their event. Really awesome research out of that team. Wiz, Permiso, and then Jesse and my team of awesome folks at Red Canary, right? They also published a bunch of cloud research. So look across these resources. I have not found anything better than MITRE ATT&CK to start to prioritize your TTPs and map. And if you find those cloud resources, those threat reports a little bit lacking, you can also supplement like we do, right? Do your own testing. Red Canary created Atomic Red Team. Datadog has Stratus Red Team, both awesome and powerful tools. Again, not pushing it because it's their event. Great tool. Other tools you could look at, CloudGoat, Azure Hound. And the idea here, right, be your own adversary. Create your own data, right, that then you can funnel into better detections. As you're following these cloud threats, if you choose to use MITRE ATT&CK, which I recommend, keep you organized, a couple of things to think about. We talk about TTPs as one thing. They're actually separate, right? In this case, the tactic, how does the adversary achieve their goal? Persistence or privilege escalation. The technique, account manipulation, and then we have sub-techniques. Well, if I told you, detect account manipulation, that's not going to be very helpful. Right? So you really have to get to that procedure level, right? This is an example on the Attack website, Scattered Spider, that threat group. They used AWS Consoler, really getting into the weeds. Then I can pass that off to my detection team as an Intel analyst and feel good about that. With that, I'm going to pass it off to Jesse to deep dive a little bit more into a ransomware intrusion, which, a spoiler alert, goes across both on-prem endpoint and also cloud.
Yeah. Thanks, Katie. So like you mentioned, we're going to be talking about Storm 0501. Microsoft published a blog a few weeks ago detailing how an adversary moved from an on-prem environment to the cloud. And I'm going to specifically walk through all the different cases and point out areas where prevention might be the best place to put or for detection. And I want you to keep in mind that when we're talking about preventions, it's necessarily something that you want to use to achieve a goal, preventing access to Azure, locking down a certain environment, and then detection is hopefully going to fill in the gaps for the risks that you're accepting where preventions might not work or where you can't place them for various business reasons. So in the first phase of the attack, during the initial access, we did not get too much information on exactly how they got in. We assume that they either simply logged in or they exploited a vulnerability. And if they simply logged in, then this is yet another point where endpoint and cloud are very much similar, because adversaries recognize now that it's much easier to log into an environment than it is to hack in, because credentials are everywhere. So we want to make sure that our number one goal is to protect credentials because they are supremely important for protecting your overall environment. Then the adversary started to move laterally, started to perform reconnaissance, and started to look for more and more credentials in the environment, because adversaries know that those credentials are super useful for them, and so they're going to be targeting them. And for these different phases, you want to try and build detections around these because they are good, high-quality alerts, and we only need to detect one alert and one breadcrumb to start building out that total threat narrative. An area that detections might not be as useful for an alert, but are very useful for the narrative to build the total attack chain is reconnaissance. Reconnaissance is very much something that is high noise, and so it can be pretty difficult to detect that actual technique. But once you start building the narrative and you start actually detecting things like credential access or lateral movement, the reconnaissance can help build that overall narrative, can help you understand exactly how the adversary is moving throughout the environment and what they want to be targeting. Ultimately, they ended up finding a path to Azure, and they tried to log in, but it was blocked by conditional access, a great prevention technique. Along with MFA, these two things can help protect your environments, especially in cloud environments, to prevent adversaries from gaining access. And of course, we all know adversary, they totally gave up after this because they were blocked. They tried to log in. They said, oh no, let's go home. We don't have to worry about it anymore. These guys are too good for us. But of course, we know that didn't actually happen. So they continued to persist, and they said, I want to gain access to Azure, so I'm going to find a path that circumnavigates this conditional access and this MFA. So they continued to move laterally. And so we can see here how preventions are actually forcing the adversary to perform actions on the environment. So we're giving us more time to try and detect them before they actually get to the impact stage. And so we see more and more lateral movement, more reconnaissance, until they eventually found an identity that satisfied their goals. It had access to Azure, it had global admin, and they were able to reset the password and register a new device. Now, this is also a great place for detection, but it starts to hit on where we actually look for combining different data sources to build a detection that is a combination of multiple API events. So they did this password reset, they did the MFA, and then they gained access to Azure by pivoting to find a path through the conditional access. If we combine the anomalous login with the other activities like password reset and MFA, device registration, those two things together actually provide a much better alert than any one individually, because you want to make sure that your detections provide actionable information for your analysts, and it provides context to what's going on. Understanding that this is an admin account, understanding that it probably shouldn't be accessing the Azure environment from this place because it is not somewhere that it's logged in previously. And so combining these together can give us a much better alert than any individual one. Once they gain access to the cloud, they then pivoted through, gave themselves persistence, gave themselves more permissions over the data because the global admin was not enough for this environment. And then they got access to the data itself. So this account manipulation stage, if we think about attack in the persistence and the account manipulation for their execution, very important to build the alerts in this space, combining the data sources together to give ourselves better alerts than any individual event alone, because this can be much more useful for the analysts. Eventually, they gain access to the data, and this is where prevention techniques can help us a lot, because you want to make sure that you're not exposing data publicly, just in general, never mind for an adversary performing activity. And then they gained access to exfiltrating the data through this public access. And at this stage, detections might be a little too late because you can have on the order of a couple minutes for alerts to even navigate their way through something like CloudTrail. And it might be too late for you to actually prevent the activity through a detection. So you're really relying on good prevention techniques at this stage, and you're trying to catch them as early as possible to the left of the actual impact. And then eventually they were able to perform their ransomware, deleting the data, encrypting the rest of it, and then extorting the victim. So let's take a look overall at this activity and look at how we can build good preventions and good detections for this specific use case. So our goal at the moment is to prevent unauthorized access to Azure. And they did that through conditional access policies and MFA. Two very easy wins for your environment. It can be a little difficult to set up, but they actually do work. And it did in this case. It just, the adversary continued to persist and continued to move laterally until they were able to circumnavigate it. And then from the detection side, you're looking at anomalous login And you also want to make sure that you're doing continuous monitoring of policy enforcement, making sure that that global admin role does actually have MFA on it and can't be password reset, and that it can't log in from a place that it shouldn't necessarily be able to. So one thing to keep in mind is that preventions should be tied to a specific security goal. In this case, unauthorized access to Azure, and detections fill in areas where that might not be able to be implemented. If you think about from an endpoint standpoint, that is something like a legacy device that has a known vulnerability, but you can't patch for whatever reason. It happens all the time. And you want to make sure that your prevention, if it cannot be applied, then detections will cover that known gap where I can't patch this. And so I need to build good detections around it to make sure that if it does get hacked and popped, then you can actually detect the adversary before they get to the impact stage. So as we move into understanding how to build detections, we can also look at the data, because the data is the most important part. Katie talked about previously how there's thousands of permissions, thousands of different ways to access the environment. So you want to make sure that you're actually building good detections with quality data. The three main ways we look at it is you have data that can be used for solo detection, which is necessarily an API event that alone by itself presents a high enough risk and is low enough noise that you can build a detection on it. Adding federated domains in this case is something that is probably a good enough alert that by itself, something weird is going on. Admins generally should not be doing this all the time. And so if it does happen, you might want to actually reach out to them just to verify that it actually is something that they're doing and not an adversary. Then we move into what we call narrative. So this is account manipulation, things that by themselves can be risky, but are not necessarily malicious. So adding administrator privileges to an account. It actually honestly happens a fair amount of time, and it can be difficult to reach out to everyone anytime they do this, because you could have test accounts, not just your production. And so you actually want to build API events together in a chain to build that alert. So you could have 2 or 3, generally a few alerts that are tied together to actually build that context for the analyst. And then at the end is correlation, generally reconnaissance. So reconnaissance can be really tricky to actually build a good detection for. And so you can group them together, and that actually helps you build the overall threat narrative, but not necessarily alone can be an alert. But of course, it depends on your environment. Maybe you are adding federated domains dozens of times a day for whatever reason for your business. So you want to make sure that you think about these categories in context of your own environment to make them much more useful. And then finally, this is a actual red team test that we detected in a customer environment a couple weeks ago. And this was them prepping a user to actually perform the activities. And so what they did was they created a new user, which by itself happens all the time, not necessarily malicious because they have no method to access the environment and they have no permissions on the environment to do anything. Then they created a login profile, which is getting a little bit more suspicious because now they have access. Eventually, they created an access key, which is a little bit more suspicious than just the create login profile because now they have persistent access. And it's not necessarily good hygiene. You should be using single sign-on, temporary keys, those sorts of things. So those three together might be an alert, but it still doesn't give them permissions, so they can't do anything on the environment. And then eventually they attached admin access, which now we have a situation where we have a new user who has access and now has admin access to the environment, and they can do whatever they want. And so that all 4 together is a great alert for an analyst. So I'll pass it back to you, Katie, to wrap up what we talked about today.
So we've talked about a lot, comparing endpoint and cloud. So a couple key takeaways to come back to. First off, whatever your background is, even if you're just an endpoint person, right, use that foundational knowledge to apply to the cloud, right? Whether it's a kill chain or any other foundation. There are definitely similarities and also differences in tracking and following cloud threats. So be aware of those. Things like attribution might be a little trickier in the cloud. When in doubt, though, right, prioritize, follow the threats. What are those actors doing in the cloud? We gave you lots of resources to check out. And then, as Jesse explained, right, think pretty carefully about how you detect threats in the cloud. Don't just yeet all of the things in there for the recon tools, right? You're going to have a bad day. So slow down, think about how can you use all of that knowledge about cloud threats, then you're going to be able to detect successfully. With that, I think we're at time. That's all we had. If we have time, we can take a couple questions. Thank you all so much.
And those are all the talks we have for today. A huge thank you to David, Megan, Katie, and Jesse for sharing their insights with us. Before we transition to the Q&A, we'd like to share an opportunity for you to get familiar with some of the concepts we discussed today. The activity will walk you through all of our detection tools in the Datadog platform. Those who successfully complete the challenge will even have a chance of winning a pair of Datadog socks. Check out the link below to view the full instructions. We'll also send that out to you in an email after the session is over.
Thank you again to everyone for joining us. Let's go live to our panel to answer some questions. Hey folks, thank you again to everybody that's still with us, and thank you to all of our fantastic speakers. We've got everybody on that you just saw to answer some questions, along with two folks from the Datadog Security Research Organization. Do you want to say hi real quick, Zach and Anthony?
Sure. Anthony, how about you go first?
Hey, Anthony Rendazzo. I lead detection engineering for our security products here at Datadog.
And Zach Allen, Senior Director of Detection here at Datadog. Thanks for coming, everyone.
So we have a ton of awesome questions. I'm going to just try to marathon through them to make sure that we can answer as many as we can live. So panelists, I will ask you to keep your answers short-ish. And if anybody wants to expand, the questions obviously don't have to be for a single panelist, because I think everybody has something to say on almost every question that we have. So first question about the first session was, what was the peak software you mentioned, David, for baselining?
Yeah, so that is a framework developed by Splunk. If you search for the PEAK framework, it should come right up, and super recommend it. It's a great way to formalize your threat hunts while also generating detections and like outcome-driven results. It's one of the best I've come across. So yeah.
Second question, also for David, but I'm sure that everybody has something to say on this. What do you see with cryptocurrency miners? So are they the initial access and then like the end game kind of situation, or are people using those like for misdirection or part of a multi-stage attack path?
So it's going to be a little of both. So I was kind of joking about this in the chat. For whatever reason, these cloud people get these supply chain compromises, and they'll deploy crypto miners. It's definitely going to be something that you should address. It's not always going to lead to some follow-on attack, but that definitely means you have some sort of compromised container or container that's running some sort of unauthorized software. So I would always assume that could lead to follow-on activity, and there are often times where it does.
I'd be interested to hear from Katie and Jesse here. I feel like David mentioned, there's these like really elegant, beautiful initial access type of attacks that happen and then result in crypto miners. Are you seeing anything from the telemetry you have in terms of, maybe the payload isn't a crypto miner? Is there more advanced access happening? Are they going after more than just like a couple XMR in their wallets? The thing that scares me is that the A teams are watching some of these initial access patterns, and they're going to start using them soon.
Yeah, I'll let Jesse chime in as well. I think when we were starting to look at like the cloud threat landscape, we were joking a little bit, like it's a lot of crypto miners, which is not necessarily the most exciting. But I would say from what I've seen and from what visibility others have as well, it's a lot of it, which is fascinating because I don't know, we often, and I talk about this a lot, like we often overestimate the impact or the prevalence of advanced persistent threats when a lot of it is just crypto mining. So Jesse, I'm not sure if you had a different perspective.
Yeah, I mean it's mostly crypto mining from the impact standpoint. And then the other thing that they try and focus on is just credentials. So it's people trying to harvest credentials to then allow other people to do crypto mining. And it's just like this is great, super awesome feedback loop here.
Yeah, cool. Detection tip, FYI, is you can pull the SSH keys out of a lot of these crypto mining scripts, like the XMRig, a lot of times drops. They'll hard code those, drop them into a YAR rule. Threat actors don't really change those too often. Easy to find on VirusTotal.
Great, thank you. Our next question will direct at Anthony first, and then I'm sure that Megan will have a follow-on here, which is, what is the normal or acceptable threshold for the number of false positives? That could the number that you set be a risk in and of itself?
Yeah. So when I think about false positives, I'll frame this from like a metrics nerd perspective. False positives only matter because of the time that it's actually wasting with those that are triaging. So I actually frame it. I use this as an interview question. So I ask, like, you have a detection where you have a 90% true positive rate, right? But it takes 30 minutes to do that. And then you have another detection that's, say, 5 out of 10, 50% true positive rate, but those only take 5 minutes. So which one's actually more efficient as a detection? And it's the one with a higher false positive rate. So the way I actually measure it is our mean time to respond or mean time to investigate. So our goal as detection engineers is to make sure that the people that are actually looking at it, whether it be ourselves or SOC, are building the most efficient detections as far as instrumenting context and driving down that mean time to respond. So to answer your question more directly, I don't think there's a good number there. It should really tether to your mean time to respond, and there's ways to accelerate that, whether it be SOAR or now we've got agentic AI investigations. Megan?
Yeah. So yeah, my answer is kind of the same at the high level of there is no number I can throw at you and say this is the perfect rate. It kind of goes back to what I said is one contributing factor is your organization. What is your acceptable thing? As Anthony said, 5 minutes to triage may be fine if you're a large SOC and have the hands, but maybe that 5 minutes is actually in relative is a bigger amount of time for a person who doesn't have all the time in the world to spend triaging alerts. I think with the risk side of things, you are accepting risk. I think that also shows how the false positive rate is also rule specific. So a rule like reconnaissance, I probably want to keep that false positive rate low. It's going to be common and it doesn't really tell me much about an attack. But if I'm talking about a crypto miner running on a host where it's like we just said, like one of the end goals, not as common to see, indicates they're in your environment, I'm going to accept that risk less than I would with a recon-based detection. So I think that's a contributing factor. I also feel like at this point, I'd also say that I think the landscape's going to change. These AI SOCs are being formed where an AI built into Cloud SIM products where they're doing a lot of triage. So once those are accurate enough to actually have pretty good faith in, we can accept a higher false positive rate if those AI systems can filter those out or even custom workflows for yourself. So that's kind of why I say it definitely varies per rule, it varies per organization, but you do have to accept risk. As I said in the end of my talk, you don't accept risk and your SOC's going to be bad. You accept risk, and when an incident happens with the risk you accepted, there's going to be problems too. So it's really about finding that balance based on the rule you're looking at.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and just follow that on for the next question, which is actually about AI SOC tools. And I would like to hear from Katie first for this one. Do you feel like the appetite for detection engineering accuracy or the efficacy of rules is going to change as we do think about things like applied AI for the SOC? To borrow a quote from your talk, it could be like eating your rules into your SIM with AI. And then what do we do? Like, how do we measure efficacy? How do we ensure consistent quality over time?
It's interesting. I think that what we've actually observed is that people are so skeptical of AI right now that they're valuing human review more than ever, which seems sort of, I don't know, contradictory to what you would expect. Um, I don't think there's a good answer. I think we are going to have to think about like how we measure efficacy differently. And, you know, if you would compare a human to an AI agent, like even if the AI agent made fewer mistakes, like are you okay with that? I feel like we're still anchoring a lot on like the human piece. What we've tried to do is really have a human make the initial decision and like guide the AI. I don't know. My hope is that if we do that smartly as a community and you have human in the loop constantly, double checking, looking at weird things, I think that we can probably drive down or improve our efficacy rates. But I don't know. I'm curious what others think about this one.
Yeah, I actually have a very interesting question. So, what I've been really seeing is less on the AI side and more giving your detection team a seat at the SOAR table. So, maybe they can write more broad detectors that don't really get presented to the end analyst until there's that extra filtering or analysis that maybe doesn't exist in your initial tech pipeline goes through. So, that's what I've been really seeing more. I'm curious, yeah, what others are doing or seeing around there.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I was going to say as well, because I've always viewed like when I build an analytic, if I'm building a detection or an analytic for a threat hunting engagement versus an actual alert, like I approach those two very differently.
Yeah.
And so with AI, I can do the same thing where it's like, oh, I'm writing this detection for an AI analyst versus a human one, so I'm going to approach it a little differently. Along with, we've been trying to focus on what we're calling like the path to automation for some teams, where it's like we build something that the AI can just handle without too much interaction. And as we get better at understanding how it processes it, we can then build that into like a very tight, bespoke detection that has low false positives and is very good. So it's like it's just a tool in that path to build better detections is kind of how I view it a lot of the times.
I have one worry on this, Joe Slowick recently wrote a post on intelligence poverty or threat intelligence poverty, and the basic premise behind it is that like there's a consolidation of knowledge or capital, and only a certain amount of people or companies have access to that knowledge. And it makes me wonder, with AI SOCs, is there going to be that same amount of consolidation? Is your SOC only going to be as good as the number of tokens you can buy
Mm.
from the different providers? And what I mean by that is if you have a bigger budget or more tokens, you can open up the breadth of your detections and you can have a lot more false positives and more visibility because you can afford it. And then what does that in turn do to people that want to work at companies like that, where maybe their lives are a little bit easier versus like a smaller shop? And so, uh, that blog post immediately like resonated with me because we've been doing a lot of AI SOC work here as well, and it looks like these large kind of foundational model companies are going to be at the forefront of it. So how do people interact with that from small shops all the way to big shops?
Yeah, something I'll actually throw out as well is, and that I didn't really think about is open source tools also have a lot of public data for their event logs and the stuff that they generate. So a lot of AI tools are going to have a lot better results with open source tools. So like if you're using a tool like Zeek or even just like the Windows event logs, just things that are really well publicly known. Um, you'll have much more success with AI tools just because that data has been available for so long. It's just accumulated over the years for it to have been trained on.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
also wonder, just as a quick thought of like how synonymous is this with the age of mainframes? Are we viewing these foundational models as like mainframes back in the day, and then as we go forward, they'll get smaller and smaller and smaller and more ubiquitous? Well, I hope that would be really cool, but I also don't know what's going to happen.
Hack the Gibson.
Yeah, I think David kind of nailed it on the AI front from a detection engineering space. What I've seen and observed in building some of this agentic stuff is the investigative strategies is kind of like well documented, and it's actually outperforming what we would consider like an entry level analyst. But on the detection engineering side, it only knows what it knows. So when we're talking about emerging threats and things like that, I don't think it's going to replace us anytime soon. I do see it as a force multiplier. I have no desire to write KQL or SPL or SQL anymore. Like it probably does 80, 90% of that. And then I'm just kind of iterating through it.
There's a lot there to chew on. We could have an entire event just on the economics of incorporating assisted AI workflows in your detection, engineering, and triage process for sure. There's another question here that's kind of like taking this and pivoting it a little bit to what's going on like more broadly in the CSP space. So there was a question about major cloud providers and how they're either helping enable folks to write better detections or not helping write better detections. Does somebody want to just like jump in here and talk about that? And well, like we haven't said OCSF yet. This is probably like a good time to just mention a little bit about what's going on in the OCSF space. Anybody want to kick that off?
So I think we've always had this problem from a SIM detection engineering perspective, right? Like nobody's ever agreed on some data model, and I think OCSF is probably as close as we as a community have gotten. So I do think it's going to accelerate the agentic understanding of our underlying data models without having to stitch it all together. But there's also an opportunity for for it to make those inferences and be able to connect to data without a clean data model. So I don't really know if it's capable of doing that, but I guess time will tell.
Any other comments on OCSF or the ways that we're unifying signals across things like endpoint and control plane? Things that are really working well, things that aren't working well. All right, we'll go ahead and move on to a different topic. This one I think is for the Red Canary folks. Can you give examples of how your team has dug deeper into specific procedures?
Yeah, I can go ahead and start with that one. So one of the examples I was thinking of is, trying to detect tools like CloudGoat, Stratus Red Team, things like that. And so we approach it from various standpoints where we look at like IOC type detectors. So for things like CloudGoat, they build very easy identifiable IDs when they run the scenarios. So it's like that's a very easy win for detection. Let's just go ahead and throw that in there. But then we also want to look at the behavioral aspects. So we take a look at, okay, well, what is this scenario actually doing? Lambda pass role privilege escalation. We'll take a look at, okay, how does that work? What are the types of logs that we can use to actually detect on it? So diving in is a factor of like, how does this technique work, along with, well, what data sources do I have that I can combine together to build multiple detections? Because when an analyst sees it for an event, we want to make sure that they see, 2 or 3 different events that are different detections, so they know that, okay, something weird is going on here versus this is just one of my detectors tripped. I don't exactly know the context or what's going on here. So that's kind of how we've approached it, but I'd be interested to hear what y'all do at Datadog or elsewhere.
Datadog folks, any comments there on how we study specific procedures?
I'd be interested in what Megan has to say about this because I see her do a lot of it on the internal Slack channels and pull requests.
Yeah, so we're basically, because I've been moving more into the threat hunting side and using that to assist the detection engineering side. So what I kind of do is I start with a high level. I kind of go down this path that was shown on the Red Canary slide. So I'll be like, okay, I want to look at persistence in AWS. What persistence technique do I want to use? Let's look at credentials being created. Okay, now let's look at specifically access keys being created. And then I start diving into our data and I'll see what's normal in our environment and what's not. And that kind of guides me that way. I definitely do this like, how far can I break it down? Like that slide, I think there's one that showed like the tactic, the technique, and then the procedure level. So I start with the broader topic and try to understand what's most relevant to my organization and also what visibility I have. We didn't really, I don't think any of our, I mean, the network one kind of did, but we didn't go in depth on visibility, but visibility drives a lot of what you can do with detections. So I also use that to guide kind of my detection path of, well, here's some procedures that are worth looking at, but like which ones am I actually going to most effectively be able to detect based on the data we have available? But but I use MITRE heavily. And then I think it came up in the chat talking about a lot of threat intel reporting is actually very useful for these procedural things. So like right now, I'm working on a hunt for macOS info stealers and a couple that are very common on the landscape right now. And those blog posts are one of the about those stealers where it breaks down the malware analysis, give a lot of really good TTPs to look for, and specifically the procedure level. So those are a few ways I look at things.
There's a good follow-on question to this here as well, which is like, what are you all seeing in terms of the amount of time that it takes an attacker to go from, like, let's say, a set of credentials in an info stealer scenario to actually leveraging those and executing an attack path? Are we talking about seconds, minutes, hours?
I want to hear what everyone else has to say, because I honestly feel like we don't have the data to say. We often see a very specific part of the chain. It's like the initial execution, and we don't see like from the initial access to the impact, because ideally the impact doesn't happen. But I'm curious, like if anyone has a better answer than it depends, which is a terrible, frustrating answer.
No, it's a sign
no,
of a senior. All seniors say it depends. So.
Yeah. I'll say it depends, but it also depends on the attack surface, I think. So like when we think about like computer to cloud or whatever the attack chain may be, like when we think about the attack surface of like say cloud control plane, right? Like it's almost instantaneous, meaning you have an exposed credential and it's just fully automated. So you know the time to impact is pretty quick as opposed to, you know, say like the ransomware operators where I think the number was like 45 minutes till impact or something like that. So it depends on the attack surface, I think.
Yeah, certainly, I think that's the question everybody's trying to answer when they think about SOAR workflows and detection workflows, like how fast reasonably do I have to be able to respond in order to mitigate the blast radius of a specific thing?
Yeah, I'll be interested to see if there's ever like a minimum, because I know that some adversaries will wait on execution just to evade sandboxes that only run 10 minutes or whatever it may be. So it'll be interesting to see if there's ever a low end on that.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good one to wrap on. We're actually just about out of time here. Just real quick, though, I want to thank all of our fantastic speakers and the Datadog folks for being here with us for the live panel, and most importantly, you for joining us for the second ever Datadog Detect. The recordings will be available via email right after the webinar is over. They'll also be available on YouTube at a little longer time horizon. And then Anthony, do you want to share a little bit about our hands-on exercise that we have and a chance to win some Datadog swag?
Well, oh, sorry. So yeah, before we sign off, we just want to remind you that our threat hunting exercise is live and ready for you to access in the link displayed here. We've also linked it in the chat for you. So this is your chance to get hands-on with some of the concepts we covered today using Datadog detection tools. And then when you complete the exercise, you're automatically entered for a chance to win a pair of Datadog socks. So be sure to check it out.
And we actually, this is designed to map to all of the sessions that you just saw. So the concepts from all three sessions are represented in kind of this little scavenger hunt through the Datadog platform.
How long do they have, Andrew, is the question?
The challenge runs, I believe, a week, maybe 2 weeks. It's not a month, so definitely do. It takes less than 10 minutes to complete the challenge, so jump on that if you want to win a pair of socks. All right, well, with that, we'll go ahead and call it a wrap for the second edition of Datadog Detect. Thanks for being here, and we'll see you next time.